Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar on HOPWA flexibilities and virtual inspections. Before we do, I wanted to just go over a couple of logistical points. The first is that this webinar will be recorded for reference later. It'll be posted on the HUD Exchange just as soon as we can get it up there, probably in a week or two. However, the webinar is currently available as a handout in your handout section of your GoToWebinar panel. So if you want to download that and follow along today or save that for your reference from the handout section today, you're welcome to do that. Also in your handout section is a tool that's going to be referenced that you can also download and are welcome to save. However, if you don't want to save those today, those will be posted alongside the webinar recording on the HUD Exchange. And today's presentation is also going to include a few video files as examples. So those will be available as well for reference and posted on HUD Exchange after. The second main point we wanted to go over was questions. You should all have joined in mute just to keep feedback, background noise to a minimum so we can all hear. If you, for some reason, are not in mute, or if you're joining on phone and somehow your phone is not on mute, if you could please just remember to mute yourself, that'd be greatly appreciated. If you have questions throughout, we encourage you to ask any questions you have either in the question box of your GoToWebinar panel or the chat box, whichever you have and works for you. There will be a time for answering questions at the end of today's webinar. If we don't get to everyone's question, which is highly likely, please don't panic. We'll be following up with unanswered questions offline. Okay. With that, I think we're going to dive in to do a few introductions. So today, joining us, we do have some staff from HUD's Office of HIV Housing, who they're going to be available mostly at the end of the presentation to help answer any questions or comment on what we go over. So Rita, Ben, Amy, did you guys want to say hello quickly? Okay, I'm not able to hear you. Rita, are you there?
Hi.
Did you want to say hello? Hello. Wonderful.
Hi, thanks. Hi, this is Rita Hartgrove, and thanks everybody for joining. We'll be here at the end for questions.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you all being here. And then for the presenters today, this is Morgan Stevenson from the Cloudburst Group. And with me from Cloudburst, I have my colleague, Steve Ellis and Heather Rhoda.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you, guys. So with that, I will pass it over to them and we'll dive into today's content. Thank you.
Okay, you can move to the next slide, Morgan. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar. As you may recall, there were two memorandum released on April 1st and May 22nd this year, which included the flexibility to utilize a waiver allowing for HOPWA habitability standard inspections to be conducted virtually. Additional information about how to access both memos is included in this presentation on slide number 26. The waiver provides flexibilities for HOPWA grantees and project sponsors to visually inspect any unit using technology. This technology can include live video streaming, pre-recorded videos, and photographs to ensure that the unit meets HOPWA habitability standards. Today, we're going to cover some important topics regarding virtual inspections and also show some examples of various virtual inspection methods, all of the three I just previously mentioned. Also, during this webinar, you're going to learn what it means to conduct a virtual inspection, how to manage the different types of virtual inspections, as well as how to plan for and implement virtual inspections flexibilities. Next slide, please. So what is included in the waivers about inspections? In summary, initial inspections for lease-up, initial lease-ups must continue. But the waiver, as previously mentioned, allows grantees and project sponsors flexibility in how the inspections are conducted. Grantees who have notified HUD of their intent to use this flexibility may conduct initial lease-up inspections using technology, live streaming, pre-recorded video, or photographs. HOPWA habitability policies and procedures currently in place, though, must be updated to include use of virtual inspection methods and also include a requirement to conduct in-person on-site inspections after special measures are no longer needed. Next slide. Thank you. So are there any flexibilities for conducting annual inspections? The first slide I was talking about was focused on initial inspections. So yes, there are flexibilities for conducting annual inspections, though a waiver is not required for this. Annual in-person on-site inspections may be postponed or they may be conducted virtually. In either case, if you're going to postpone them or conduct them virtually, your current policies and procedures should be updated accordingly. During the annual recertification process, the process for which you are gathering information about household income, assets, etc., to determine continued eligibility, HUD does expect that program staff will, at a minimum, check in with clients about the condition of their units, particularly if annual inspections are going to be postponed or delayed. Part of that, as part of checking in with your clients during the annual reinspection process, if you're going to be doing it, postponing them or conducting virtually, you could ask your clients similar questions, such as, is the smoke detector operating correctly? Are you having any issues with the refrigerator or stove? Do you have any broken or cracked windows? Basically, checking in with your clients to make sure that there aren't any issues going on with the unit, so that you can work with them to get those issues fixed. You could include that as a list as part of your annual recertification process in your paperwork, and just have a dialogue and communication back and forth with your client and the assisted household about the condition of their unit. Next slide. So this is where Steve is going to take over, and we're going to talk about what does it mean to conduct a virtual or remote inspection.
Right, so as we start to dive in, go ahead and move to the next slide. When we talk about conducting virtual inspections, we're referring to conducting inspections via live streaming, pre-recorded videos, or photographs. And if you do use photographs, this is usually in combination with some other methodology, as you'll see through some examples later. But to make sure that we're all on the same page for what we mean when we talk about these three methods, live streaming means that from a remote location, HOPWA program staff is live with a landlord or a client or someone else in the unit during the inspection and walking them through an inspection, basically as if they were conducting the inspection themselves. Examples of software platforms for live streaming could include Zoom, GoToMeeting, FaceTime, or anything similar like that, as you've probably been using professionally and personally for the past few months. When we talk about pre-recorded videos, we mean in most cases, the landlord or a client or someone representing the landlord taking videos of all areas of the building, inside and outside of the unit, and HOPWA program staff are then reviewing those videos as they would as if they were on site. Finally, photographs mean in most cases, someone taking pictures of all areas of the building, inside and outside the unit, and HOPWA program staff would be reviewing those videos to make sure it meets whatever inspection requirements your program uses. So it's pretty obvious, right, that there are differences between these virtual methods, but it's important to understand these differences because this is going to affect how you plan for, implement, and manage these inspections. So before we dive into more specifics on these topics, we thought it would be a good idea to show you what it would look like. So Cloudburst conducted a mock inspection on a vacant 2-bedroom unit in our area using all three of these virtual methods. We have a total of 4 videos, 2 sets, as you'll see, and each set focuses on a particular area of a unit, right? So we're not going to show an entire inspection video, as that would be much longer probably than we have time for, but you'll see just some little clips, and then we'll compare those clips. So the first set is taking place in a bathroom where we're going to look at the bathroom sink. The second set is looking at a living room window. And what you'll see is myself, Steve, acting as the HOPWA program staff, and Heather acting as the landlord. So as a little more background as you watch these virtual inspections that we conducted, we just wanted to give you a little background on our mock family. So for this particular inspection, we have a family that's using TBRA that's moving to a new unit in a neighborhood that's pretty close to the client's workplace. It's worth noting that the client has 2 children, both girls under the age of 6, and the building was constructed prior to 1978. We already know that the gross rent for the unit meets rent standards and rent reasonableness. So therefore, the HOPWA program staff, Port Landing, scheduled an inspection with the landlord. Before the inspection, we talked with the landlord, Heather, about some things that she should be aware of, right? So she didn't go in blindly when she was doing these, particularly when it came to these 3 different methods. So without further ado, let's look at live streaming of the bathroom sink.
Your lights both seem to be working. While you're at the sink, can you turn the sink on for me?
Yep. I know normally you might want to check like the water temperature. You know, that'd be something you could follow up with the tenant, but I can tell you touching it, it's warm.
Yeah. I'll make sure to note that it is warm, and then what I'll do is once the tenant moves in, I'll just confirm with them.
Okay, yeah.
Also for our files, but
okay.
I do.
And I'll leave it running for a minute. You can see that everything is secure. There's no leaking. There hasn't been evidence of leaking. You can see too that the wall is solid. There's no stains or.
Right.
Yeah, and I can even feel in the piping here that the water's warm or cool on the side there.
And thank you for leaving the water running, because it also shows that it doesn't seem like your pipes are backed up or clogged at all.
Yeah,
Clean
right. And
drain.
there's a
Excellent.
trap too that's in the sink that is working well up and down.
Great.
So as you can see through our Zoom call for this inspection, that was one example of looking at just one portion or one component of one room, in particular the bathroom sink, the sink itself, the water, and underneath. So for comparison, now let's look at a pre-recorded video that our landlord Heather took of the exact same area.
Now I'm going to turn on the sink. The water is warm, but again, you can just confirm that with the tenant. I'm going to leave it running a bit so we can see if there's any leaks or evidence of leaks. There's no staining on the wall behind where there might be water leaking or any dripping. And there's no staining coming down to the linoleum. Turn that off.
As you can tell, our landlord was pretty well prepared for what it is that she needed to show us for the bathroom sink.
Thankfully, to the lengthy conversation and planning that I was able to have with Port Landing rental assistance program staff.
Right. And then our last example, before we compare the three, are photographs of the exact same component, the bathroom sink. So there we go. There are pictures of the bathroom sink. So as you can tell, as we mentioned, these three different virtual inspection methods are all radically different and are going to radically shape the work that you're going to need to do beforehand, during, and after. So particularly as someone who is portraying the HOPWA program staff, I particularly, when we were doing the live streaming, I basically was instructing the landlord where to go. So that way I could see anything that I needed to see as I filled out my form. As you could see, I was also taking notes, not just for my own follow-up, but also for things that would be impossible for me to know until the tenant gets there. So one thing you'll hear us say a bit throughout this inspections webinar are that inspections are very interactive with all of your senses, right? Your sight, your smell, your touch. So some of the things that I would definitely be following up with the client once they move in was the water temperature. So I believe the landlord, I took the note that the hot water was hot and the cold water was cold, but I'll still follow up with the tenant just to make sure that that's true, because they'll be the judge to let me know if it meets what they think it needs to meet. The videos, the pre-recorded videos were clearly a little different. I did not have the ability to instruct in the moment, but as Heather had mentioned, Port Landing gave the landlord a lot of information, and some of those specifics we'll go over a little later, how you prep for that, right? But the landlord was well aware of what I needed to see and how I needed to see it, as well as going slow enough that I could catch it. And then later on, after the landlord sent me these clips through some secure method, right, I was able to watch them and rewatch them and pause and fill out my inspection paperwork, and same idea, take any notes that I needed to take. And finally, as you can see here, the photographs for program staff, not as telling. As we had mentioned, that's why usually these are done in conjunction, either with some other method like the live stream or pre-recorded video, or there would be quite a number of pictures to make sure you can capture everything, including some intensive follow-up with the tenant. So Heather, as the landlord, what were some lessons that you can share through these three methods in the bathroom?
As far as the live streaming, it felt a lot more comfortable that we would catch everything in the first round of the inspection, because it felt like you were almost there in the unit doing the inspection with me, right? Like being the landlord, I had some experience with other housing programs, doing inspections. So I was a little bit familiar, with how to go through a unit. So the live streaming was definitely more comfortable because it felt like you were right there and I could ask questions. And like you said, you could direct me where to go and we could, keep it organized and focus on exactly what we needed to do. The recordings were good too, although I think that some of the recordings might have been a lot of recording because I wanted to make sure that as the program staff, you received enough information. But also too, if I did have a question while I was recording, you did know ahead of time the day that I was doing the inspection. And you said that you would be available and then I could call you if I had a question or if I forgot something. The photographs, although, here in this picture, you could certainly see that there's no, water damage, right? There's no evidence of leaking. So that supports that. But definitely using the photograph in conjunction with either, live streaming or a recording or as follow-up to, something we might have missed does make a lot of sense.
And I think that idea of follow-up, particularly using photographs, can be really key, right? So if you've already done a live streaming or a series of videos, pre-recorded videos, and maybe there was something that you needed follow-up on, that doesn't necessarily mean me as the program have to ask the landlord to go back in and do another live stream, right? It could just be, here's a small component that the landlord needed to fix or the property manager needed to fix. So when you get that completed, if you could take a photograph and send that, because that photograph in conjunction with this other method is a really good follow-up without all of the additional work of scheduling something, make sure it's secure, someone emailing clips, right? It's a lot more smoother as sort of that end of your inspection process.
Right, and I also noticed too that we had talked about these photographs that they're not like date stamped or time stamped. I mean, or noted on the photograph itself, what sink this is that I'm inspecting, right? And generally, you're only going to have one bathroom, but there could be a half bathroom. So what sink is this and where is this? Where you would, it would be a lot more intuitive and you would hear that either in the pre-recorded inspection or the live streaming inspection.
So for those of you listening, also feel free if you have any questions or other things you've noticed about these three examples, please throw it into the questions or chat box. Particularly a lot of you on the call on this webinar are those who are doing these. So throw in some tips, right? Because what we're really trying to show you all is a framework or an idea of how you can do these. So for those of you who also do this, particularly throw in those tips. So this was one set, as I had mentioned, so focusing on one component, the bathroom sink. For a whole nother set to really drive home these comparisons, we also want to compare a living room window, what that would look like with the three methods. So let's go ahead and view the live stream living room window.
Starting with that window that faces the road, can we check the windows to make sure they work, that they're open, and that while you're there about any peeling paint, any dust, anything like that?
Okay, here's the first window. It's like a big sort of like picture window setup. It's currently locked. So what I'm going to do is go through and unlock all of them and leave them up. So they all stay up.
Great.
Also, this is to the ground right here. You're seeing the front.
So also still at first floor
So now
level.
I'm going to shut them so you can see that they're all locked. There. And this is the windowsill itself.
Looks solid. I don't
There's
see any peeling
this
paint.
this is a little bit of like scratching, maybe like some having plants on here, but it's not peeling or chipping. And it's certainly a very tiny area.
Right, and as we had talked about before you went in the unit, right, where we're looking for a certain amount of where there might be an issue, that's clearly below any concerning level. But I did make a note so that you and your maintenance guy, and particularly the tenant, will all keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't get any worse.
As you can see from that live stream video, there was a lot more that was required when we were looking at something as simple as a window, right? So opening and closing, staying open, particularly as we mentioned, our family has 2 minor children and the unit was built before 1978. So we did have to worry about chipping, peeling, cracking paint, and a visual assessment. We'll get into that in just a little bit, right? But some things that we are able to walk the landlord through in that moment. So in comparison, let's look at the same living room window via a pre-recorded video.
Okay, I'm here at the unit for a new tenant, and I spoke to the rental assistance, local rental assistance program staff, and I'm just about done doing a video inspection for them. And here I'm just looking at the bay window setup here for the living room that's looking out onto the street. And as you can see, there are no chipping, cracked, broken window panes. And I'm just going to unlock each of them and open them. So the inspectors can see, that once they're open, they stay open. They all stay open. And they shut easily. Locking mechanisms work. Locking mechanisms work. There. Also another windowsill. Another video, I was looking for peeling, chipping, cracking paint, making sure that the paint is stable, no paint is separating, and there's no wood separating. Nothing. This is all newly painted property several years ago. There's no peeling. Great.
Great indeed, landlord. So you can see we tried to get a similar method there, but it took a lot more prep work to get through that. And for the final comparison, let's look at the same living room window via some photos. So you'll see on this first slide, we have 3 pictures of the windows showing them closed. We get a sense maybe of what might be chipping, peeling, cracking, but at least, you know, we sort of have an idea of the windows themselves. And the next slide. And then there's some pictures of the windows being open. So this was another example, right, of us just looking at one component of one room as part of our inspection process. We focus on this component in particular, right, because as you are doing a lead-based paint visual assessment, looking for chipping, cracking, peeling paint inside and outside of a unit when applicable, which was for this mock family, right, we really wanted to focus in on a component that might be more likely to have issues, like a window, right? Because if that window didn't close all the way, if the window leaked, if there was a small crack, right, there's a good chance that water had gotten in and those components, particularly the frame, might be a little soft, it might be a little mushy, it might be more likely to be chipping, peeling, cracking, if not now, maybe in the future. So from a program side, you can see particularly the live stream video, being able to ask the landlord in particular what to show as I took notes. You can see there was that little dent that we were able to clarify, right? That it wasn't soft, it wasn't chipping, it wasn't peeling. But in that moment, I was able to take a note that I could keep an eye on that in the future, because knowing that there's 2 children, both under the age of 6, there's a good possibility I'm going to have to worry about lead-based paint for a number of years in this unit. So I can also then notify the client to keep an eye on that particular section of the window. The pre-recorded video was also good. I was able to tell what I needed to tell, write off what I needed to write off. As I had mentioned before, as I was taking the notes and filling out a form, I had to pause a few times, backtrack a few times, but at least it answered everything. But you'll notice in the pre-recorded video, the landlord didn't address the issue of that little divot that we know from the live stream video wasn't an issue, but it's something that I did notice through the video, so I would probably have to follow up with the landlord just to clarify what that is and make sure it was fine. And then finally, our windows. As you can tell, as I mentioned, right, you can see 3 windows closed, and it looks like no issues with paint, but it's very hard to tell. And then the landlord sent 2 pictures of open windows, so that I will definitely have to follow up with the landlord and ask about the 3rd window, and potentially, particularly for a lead-based paint visual assessment, use some other sort of virtual method so I can make sure that there's no issues around the window. As the landlord, Heather, was there anything you wanted to add?
I think just the same comments as before when we were doing the live streaming. You were able to, program staff was able to direct me through exactly, what they wanted to see. And I could open the windows, leave them open to show that they're going to stay open, right? Because that would be a safety issue for the children. You don't want windows that are going to open and then fall down on little hands. I was also able to show in real time that there weren't any broken, missing, cracked panes, that the windows locked, and you could see that I couldn't open it up after it was locked. And the same with the pre-recorded. You'll notice that the live stream and pre-recorded are similar, especially if you put in some pre-planning for the inspection, except that the live stream, it's almost like you're a landlord, like I said before, you're the landlord in your unit, in the vacant unit, just as you would be with program staff doing the inspection. It's just the program staff is at a remote location and you're in the unit instead of the program staff being in the unit with you. So they're similar. The photos, again, definitely I could see program staff wanting to follow up, because you can see that there aren't any, cracked panes, but it would be hard to tell if they lock. It would also be hard to really, clearly see if there was any, peeling, chipping, cracking paint. And for folks that have been doing inspections for a while, that's an area which often tends to have, right, like chipped paint, peeling or cracking from just putting plants on the windowsill, and just windows get a lot of use. They get a lot of wear and tear, opening up and down, so paint can get rubbed off. So that would be difficult to see with photographs. But with good planning, pre-planning and post-planning, you could use photographs along with remote methods, like a pre-recorded video or even live streaming as a follow-up. But it's definitely helpful to have program staff available during the inspection. Absolutely.
Agreed. Before we move on, I just wanted to thank people. I was looking at some of people's suggestions and comments for this, and you guys all have some really great suggestions and some keen set of eyes. So I'm feeling good about the inspectors right now out there. So thank you all for the hard work. And there's also some great questions that we will get to in a little bit. But I wanted to thank people who are definitely said you have a good set of eyes. So thank you for that. So now that we've looked at some examples, let's go bigger picture again. So if we can move on to the next slide. So I said, so we had defined these three methods, and now we looked at examples, right? So we're all 100% hopefully on the same page. So when we break down live streaming, as you can tell, it was highly interactive in the moment. The landlord and I were able to go back and forth, and it was almost like I was doing in-person inspection. So these clips were part of an hour-long inspection of this entire two-bedroom unit, right? Starting from outside, taking, so I could see the address, I got to see the street, I got to see the outside of the building. We moved into common areas. We were able to follow a similar path along the unit, always sticking to our right in this particular instance. So it was easy for me to document. I said it was very interactive. So by the end of this entire process, I had a fairly good sense and was fairly confident that this unit would pass inspection because I saw it. I had the landlord touch things. I had taken some notes. So once the client moved in, I could be 100% sure. So it was interactive in that moment. But as Heather had mentioned, right, we did have to do some pre-work for this. So that live streaming in this particular example, we happen to use Zoom because Zoom, we could have a password protected room. That way I was sure who was joining. The Zoom participant waited in the waiting room of the call until I let them join. And then from my side, I was able to keep an eye to make sure no one else joined, right? So that we, someone didn't hack into the room and was watching. Particularly, in this particular example, we used an empty unit because we're showing it to everyone and recording it, right? But not every unit's empty. So that was the other thing that to be mindful of live streaming, right? Is it's a lot easier to control confidentiality if you have a good conversation before. Next slide. So our pre-recorded videos were also highly interactive, but it was more interactive before the recorded videos. So in our planning process, when we were doing this mock inspection, we had sort of walked through everything I would need to tell Heather for an entire unit, right? So that included sharing some of the forms that I was going to have to fill out so that she could see, and then going into some of the specific things that we had to focus on because of the particular family. So the landlord and I had to have a conversation about lead-based paint and a visual assessment and why it mattered and why it would continue to matter, so that as the landlord recorded all of these videos of different rooms, including the sink and including that living room window, she could really focus in on that and make sure that as she sent me those through some secure method, that I could keep looking at them and make sure that it met not only my inspection requirements, but that lead-based paint. And as you could tell, we weren't able to interact. Clearly, it's pre-recorded, so there are some things that I definitely need to follow up on that I wasn't able to see or know during the inspection, or things I had questions about. Next slide. So our last method for virtual inspections, photographs, said also interactive, but really just in that planning phase. So as Heather and I were planning this mock inspection at this unit, this method took a lot more time, right? I really had to explain what was needed and what things she had to focus in on so that I could even have a sense. We had, for this particular method we had talked about, right? Maybe this was the only methodology that this particular landlord could do. As you can tell, this landlord had a smartphone, so she could use her iPhone for all the other methods. But particularly if there was a landlord who couldn't do anything but this. But it was very hard, that we could not interact at all during the inspection, so it required a lot of back and forth and follow-up on things such as that window, that third window, whether or not they locked. As I was looking at some of those photos, trying to get close-ups and maybe even pictures with the flash on, so I could make sure there was no chipping, peeling, cracking paint. But as I had mentioned before, a lot of your inspections, as you all know, are interactive. So you use your senses. You have to be there in the moment to know some things. So one thing that we definitely could not do via photograph was testing the smoke detector. So that was something that in that moment, I had to ask the landlord to take a video of so that we could test the smoke detector to make sure it was working, that the sound was working, that it was working in each and every room, that there was a smoke detector needed, not only for our habitability requirements, but in the particular city where this unit was, they have more strict smoke detector requirements. So it took a lot of videos to really get a sense of all the smoke detectors working. And the same for the lead-based paint visual assessment. It was tough to do with photographs, so it required some sort of follow-up with video so that I could be confident when doing my visual assessment whether or not it met those requirements. Landlord, is there anything you wanted to add for these three methods?
There isn't, no.
All right.
I think that there are nuances to, each, as we'll get into when we start talking about, how do you manage the different type of virtual inspection methods.
Right. So next slide, let's jump right into that. So as Heather had talked about, right, how do we manage these, right? Because they can be a little difficult to think through, a little unruly once you do them. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So these are just some key elements on the live streaming virtual inspections. So by no means does this cover everything. By no means would this cover everything in your particular program. So as always, if you are a project sponsor and you have specific questions, definitely check with your grantee about some of these. And if you have particular requirements for your city, your state, definitely look into those and factor those in. But these are just some high level elements. So we had mentioned this was highly interactive in the moment, and that I was remotely present during the inspection. So while I wasn't physically there, in a way, I was there in the moment. So some management of this required me providing the landlord with information about the items and current information forms or checklists, right? So that way our preparation call didn't take too long and our inspection wasn't, super long, which you'll see here at the moment or a little later on this slide, right? But anything that I could do beforehand, I definitely wanted to do. We also, for management purposes, I had to have a conversation with the landlord how the live inspection would occur, right? So we talked about what software we were able to use. I had talked about what they can expect, right? Making sure that, for example, that the landlord's phone was fully charged. They had download Zoom, that they would be put into a waiting room once they joined. All of those things, so they didn't think that the inspection wasn't happening. We also talked a little bit about confidentiality as part of that live inspection, right? That, on the live inspection, the full one, we only use initials. We never use the client's name. That way, just in case anyone was listening, as they walked by the landlord, we were keeping confidentiality. One thing that we also did was we practiced before we actually did this. So basically, I talked through another staff person about this inspection, just to make sure it made sense, because this was the first live streaming inspection I had done. And so talking with someone who also does in-person inspections can be really helpful to help you refine what you're doing virtually to make sure it matches up as well as it can to in-person. You also need to be aware of the pace of the inspection. You need, as we talked about, you don't want to go too fast or too slow, right? There were some moments as part of this whole inspection, we could go through a little quicker, but still asking the landlord to take her time. There was a number of times I would ask the landlord to focus on something again because I had missed something. I was also very clear during the inspection that the landlord would take sort of a sweeping view of the room as she entered it. We would dive into the room specifics and then take another sweeping look at the end, because that was something that I had practiced when I was doing in-person inspections. So that way I was recreating what I had already been doing. Next slide. So a few other elements for live streaming. Yeah, I had mentioned this about making sure I asked the landlord about the type and sort of technology they might have, right? Because live streaming might not be feasible, right? They may not have the hardware, they may not have the software. You will see references on this slide and throughout some of our other materials, making sure that if we were going to use Wi-Fi, that it was password protected. If the landlord was going to use their data plan, that it was also safe and secure, right? That no one could hack in. And also then talking about if they didn't have the hardware or software, was it something that our agency, our program had decided to fund, and how would we work that out? So as always, be mindful of confidentiality, right? So this live inspection was clearly live. So the landlord was on video, and so on speakerphone and voices travel. So this particular building has 3 units, and so the common area has 2 other doors. So particularly when we were outside, as we walked through the common areas, right, making sure that I, as the staff, wasn't saying anything I shouldn't say that could break confidentiality, and that we also weren't disrupting anyone else living in the unit during that moment as we were doing our back and forth.
We also have to be mindful, Steve, if I could just jump in, because you're live streaming, but this was also, you know, photographs or when I was taking video, there were some instances where other units were occupied, right? And as the landlord, I mean, as a landlord, you would know who's in the unit, but me pretending to be the landlord or like program staff, you need to be careful about any other people in the background and trying to, you know, cut that from the photo or the, you know, live streaming or the video. There were a couple of times, Steve, if you remember, where we stopped because there were people coming kind of going at the back of the unit, the common porch and stairs. We had to stop a couple of times and start again because we wanted to make sure, you know, we kept other individuals out of the recordings and the photos.
Right, and ideally in that situation too, the real landlord of that building had prepped the other tenants to know that someone was coming, so they just didn't see someone, you know, wandering around with their iPhone, gloves, and mask taking pictures. So, you know, it's another thing to keep to let a landlord know they should let other tenants know what will be going on. Speaking of background and surroundings, you'll see I was very mindful that there was nothing behind me or in my workspace that tipped the landlord off to the actual organization or program I was working for, right? We all, in our offices, we have different things up, you know, different agency names up, and particularly HOPWA identifying posters or signs, right? So please be mindful of that if you're doing a live stream. And
not only that, your organization name or your agency name itself could identify someone having someone being HIV positive or having an AIDS diagnosis, because that could be the only population that your organization or your agency serves, right? And so it's really good, as it's included here, to have for your program, for the HOPWA program and the rental assistance, to have some kind of pseudonym name that really kind of spells out and explains, you know, what the program is without saying the word HOPWA or without including your organization or agency name.
Right. All right. Next slide. And then Heather, you want to talk about what are some management elements for videos?
Sure. So regarding the pre-recorded videos, again, highly interactive during the planning phase before you're actually conducting the inspection, and then of course afterward. Program staff, HOPWA program staff who are doing the inspection, they're not remotely present during the time that the landlord or the landlord representative is, recording the inspection. So, like with live streaming, it's a good idea to provide the landlord with any inspection forms or checklists. And also with that, schedule a call with the landlord to review the forms and checklists and answer any questions. It's important too, you'll notice in some of the recordings, I narrated what it was that I was doing. And part of that was to help the program and the program staff understand where I was in the unit and what I was inspecting. So it would identify, the windows in the living room or the sink in the bathroom on the first floor. Also, for program staff, ask the landlord to notify you, the grantee or the project sponsor, the day when they'll be conducting the inspection, because that way you could make yourself available around that time block. And if the landlord did have any questions or you forgot something or was stuck on something, the landlord could give you a call and cover that right there in the moment instead of having to follow up on it after the fact. Next slide. Okay, regarding photographs, again, interactive during the inspection planning phase, again, similar to recording, program staff are not remotely present. Some of the points here are similar to the other two slides. Provide the landlord with the current inspection form or checklist, schedule a call to review the form and checklist with the landlord. Discuss with the landlord how to and what inspection items should be photographed. Prep the landlord that there will be a considerable amount of photographs taken. Explain to the landlord that smoke detector testing and lead-based paint visual assessment will need to be accompanied with recorded videos. You need to hear the smoke detector going off. You need to see, which room it is and if it's following your inspection protocol. Also with lead-based paint visual assessments, yes, you could probably see some peeling and chipping from a photograph, but the recorded video gives you a multi-dimensional view of, the surface area that might be affected versus just like a photograph. Photographs should include a date and time stamp, or also be identified, what room you're in, what window is it, what bathroom is it, what bedroom, etc. Again, go ahead and ask the landlord to notify you when they'll be conducting the inspection, because you could, again, make yourself available as the landlord is taking pictures, and the landlord could call and make sure that they're covering all the inspection areas that they need to.
All right, thank you. Next slide. So how do you plan for and implement some virtual inspections in these different methods? Next slide. So first, as you know, particularly for initial inspections and some of the waivers that have gone out, make sure to notify HUD of your intent to use these, the property standard waivers. You will also need to make sure that your policies and procedures are updated for these virtual inspections. As you can tell, and I can tell from a lot of the questions that people have been asking, right? There are a lot of details that you need to figure out, and you're going to want to make sure that your program has a policy that outlines what it is you're going to do, and a procedure that goes through a step-by-step of what different methods you're going to allow, of what you're going to do with videos, what you're going to do with pictures, what you're going to do with the live streaming video, how you're going to document, how you're going to follow up when you can do in person, right? So there's a lot of details. To help you with that, you will see in our handouts section of the GoToWebinar, there is a guide to plan for and implement HOPWA habitability, housing quality standards, virtual inspections. So this particular tool will list a series of questions to help you come up with policies and procedures updates for your program and how to write those out. And it will also give you some handy tips for when doing a virtual inspection, right? What you do beforehand, what you do during, and what you do after. So all of that can help drive your process for planning and implementing. You might have to review and update your inspection informational materials, right? So things that you give tenants, things that you give landlords, potentially even your inspection form might need to be updated. So just keep in mind, right, that the inspection is part of a whole inspection process. You need to look at it all. Next slide. So you also need to train HOPWA program staff on these different virtual and remote inspections. So you definitely want to train the inspectors, or you probably also want to inspect those who might need to fill in, or even case managers or other staff that clients might have questions, right, when it comes to this. So the more that are sort of aware of this topic, the better. So for example, you could use this video once posted, this PowerPoint or the accompanying guide as a jumping off point for your training. Also, if you are a project sponsor, check in with your grantee to see if they have anything in particular that they would want to add for any training policies or procedures. Make sure to assess the type of technology that you have on hand and identify if any upgrades to technology, either hardware or software, are needed to do any of these virtual inspections. Because if you know from previous webinars, HOPWA funding may be used to support some of these costs. And finally, as you make these changes, as you implement virtual inspections and write your policies and procedures, please make sure to be preemptive and communicate these changes to clients, to landlords, to case managers, to your community partners, right? The more, as I mentioned, the more people that are aware, the easier this is going to be. This could also really be key if you are an inspector for your program, and maybe there's a team of you that do inspections, or you're part of any groups, professional groups that all do inspections, that you can share some of these methods, some of your policies and procedures, and get some tips from others in the field as well. That way everyone's aware and everyone's doing the best they can to make sure units pass habitability and families are safe.
Also, to another point, just going back to training HOPWA program staff, and this did work. Steve and I did this, although it has been a while since we have done inspections. We have done inspections for years and years, and have done, inspections in many different types of units, but we knew that this was going to be different. So it's very different going in with your, your clipboard or your tablet, however, you're doing your inspection, when you're meeting a landlord there and you're physically walking through the unit and you can see items, you can touch the hot water, you can see the neighborhood. So it's very different to then be on the other side of that, directing someone else about where they need to go and what they need to look at. So it's a good idea to kind of practice talking another person through conducting a virtual or remote inspection, particularly if you have some newer landlords that don't have a lot of experience with housing, rental assistance or subsidy subsidy programs because an inspection will be new to them. Other landlords who have been participating, for example, with COC rental, continuum of care rental assistance, housing choice voucher inspections, although those inspections are different, still they have a rough idea of, what somebody will be going into the unit and looking for in the unit itself and the building as a whole. One last point about communicating policy changes. If you're part of like an HIV planning council, if your work in a local planning group like the continuum of care or similar, make sure you're communicating any policy changes because other programs have similar changes, not the same as HOPWA. But it's good to make sure that you're letting your partners know how inspections will be completed going forward and any changes that, affect housing clients. The last few slides, I don't know if we want to take a break and go through some questions. The last few slides are really reminders and information. We want to skip to the next slide. Slides 26 through to the end are just additional information and links and resources and things for you to be aware of. But what we could do is take a break and go through some questions and then come back to this to make sure you guys get to see everything remaining in the rest of the presentation.
Sure.
So let me see, we have, okay, let's go up here. I can shout them out.
Yeah.
Can the methods be combined as a requirement? So I'm assuming that means like the virtual method, doing live streaming, recorded videos in photographs.
Do you want to go ahead and answer that, Heather?
Sure. You could combine the methods, absolutely. I think Steve touched on that. What you need to be aware of is to make sure that you're articulating what your policy is going to be in the addendum that you're going to include in your inspection policies and procedures. It would be, for consistency, it would definitely be good to use, one method more than another. But I totally understand, thinking about geography and where grantees, right, are located, where their project sponsors are located, in rural areas where, internet may be spotty at best. You could certainly combine the various methods as long as they show and support that the unit and the surrounding building did meet HOPWA habitability.
Great. Here's a quick question for OHH staff. I'll give you a moment to prep yourself. So if you need to unmute, people want to know about, as a reminder, how do they request these waivers, and then how long the waivers are good for.
This is Amy. So it's actually not a request process. It is a notification process for the waiver. So to use the waiver flexibility around inspections that was provided in the memorandum, the grantee must notify HUD through email, that they're going to use the waiver, and there are email addresses set up for each CPD director, for each CPD field office. And so you can just send an email to them notifying them that you will be taking advantage of this waiver. And you just need to do that no less than 2 days before you anticipate using the waiver. And yeah, I would just recommend consulting the memorandum that we put out just for more specific information on that. And for the timing, so there were 2 different waivers that we put out. The first one was specifically for inspections for tenant-based rental assistance, and the second one expanded it, and that's for all housing assisted under HOPWA that requires inspections. And so the waiver is in effect for 1 year, beginning on the date of the memorandums, and it's available for grantees and project sponsors that are able to visually inspect the unit using technology and have written policies and procedures to reinspect the unit after health officials determine special measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 are no longer necessary. So the second waiver that expanded it to everyone, that was published on May 22nd. So it's in effect for a year from that. And the first waiver memorandum was published on March 31st. And that one was just for TBRA.
Great, thank you. Heather, do you have a question that you want to cover?
Yes. How long, there are various questions. So I think, let me see. Do you have to save recordings of live stream videos, recorded videos, or photos? Or can programs just complete their regular, inspection forms and checklists and note on that checklist it was completed, in whatever method it was completed in due to COVID-19 safety concerns? Want to take that one? Or would OHH like to take that one?
OHH, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think what you said is right. The documentation is important, but having the normal type of documentation that you're describing and explaining how the process was visualized through whatever methodology is important. So I don't think it's critical to keep everything
Right.
that's been that way. Yeah, just so it's documented and the methodology was documented.
Yeah. And so that should answer some other questions too, where people are asking, do we need to save photos? If we save them, how long do we need to save them? So really the short answer is no, you don't need to save them, because some of the files will be quite large, right? Depending on, the methodology that you're using. But complete your regular checklist in your form. You'd have information, right, too, about the waiver, that you notified HUD about the waiver to conduct virtual inspections, and note it on the form and how it was completed due to COVID-19. So I think that answers a few of those questions.
Yeah, and then as you mentioned, you may also want to remember and maybe keep a note of the fact that an inspection will be required later.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a good reminder too. When we talked about that at the beginning. So if you're using the waiver for initial lease-up inspections, you will, after safety measures have been lifted, you will need to go back and do on-site, in-person inspections for those units. So just be mindful of that.
And it's probably worth documenting when you, in the client file, when you did your virtual method, right, why you did that. So making a quick note at the top of any inspection form, right, why you did that. So, you know, we implemented the waiver, so this is the virtual method to meet that waiver requirement until those safety methods, those safety precautions are lifted. That way it's very clear to anyone coming in, whether that's a grantee or HUD to monitor you, what you did, why you did it, and it triggers them to make sure that you had updated policies for all of this, that you actually put in the waiver, right? So that little note in your documentation can really be key to showing that you're following what you should be following.
I want to make just a comment. Somebody submitted a comment that I thought was great. And they wanted to point out that they found virtual inspections to be efficient and helpful to overall workflow, and landlords they've worked with have also agreed. So I just wanted to point that out. So thank you.
That's great.
So Heather, I think a question that's on there that I think a lot of people are thinking about, right? Our particular example, we had a vacant unit. So could you use these same methods for an occupied unit?
You mean, so for if somebody was going to lease up in place?
Or if you decided to use it for an annual inspection?
Yes, you could. Although remember, you're not required. You can delay or postpone your annual inspection, but as part of your recertification process, definitely make sure that you have a list, sort of like a punch list of items that you're going to check in with the household about regarding the condition of their unit. But certainly if, public health directives, if it's, allowable and, you can do an inspection, you could use any one of the virtual methods.
And right, so particularly if you're going to use a virtual method for an occupied unit, just make sure that it's very clear, particularly on some topics such as like confidentiality. You know, in our particular example, we were mindful of other people in the building, but if some unit's occupied, you want to make sure that whomever is doing the inspection has already talked to the client about who else is going to be in the unit. Are they aware of your status, right? So things that you could definitely do these, but you might want to tweak your methodology and your policies and your mindset just a little bit. Because of what could be in the background or whom else might be in the unit.
Right. And I wanted to clarify initial inspections. So an initial inspection is an inspection that's occurring for the first time on a unit that's being newly leased up, right? So you could issue rental assistance to someone that's in a unit that doesn't have rental assistance yet through HOPWA, right? And wants to lease up in place. So you would be conducting an initial inspection on that unit. Or you could have someone who was newly issued HOPWA TBRA and they're moving from their current unit to a new unit. So you would do an initial inspection on that unit, or someone that has TBRA in their current unit moving to a new unit. So an initial is always related to a new unit that someone is moving into, because that unit hasn't had an initial inspection yet.
And as well, for that initial inspection, it doesn't necessarily have to be with the landlord. It should be with someone who has access to everything that you're going to need to see. You know, if there's a basement that they have access to, right? All of those little things that maybe a landlord or a property manager or a representative of a landlord might have a key to that a client or a tenant might not. So that should be part of your planning process about who are you going to do a virtual inspection with? Do they have access to everything that you're going to need to do what you need to do?
Somebody asked where they could find the waivers. And I just wanted to, you can find those on the HUD Exchange, but also too, if you, in the webinar, in the little box you have here where you're submitting questions or raising your hand, there's a box that says handouts. And if you click on that, you can download a PDF of this webinar as well as the guide, and links to both of those memos are included in the presentation itself.
So we apologize if we didn't get to everyone's questions. We want to be mindful of time. As Morgan had said at the beginning, we will definitely make sure that people get answers to their questions offline.
And also note that the clips will be available as well as a recording, and this presentation will also be available. So I want to get back to, if we can, the presentation so we can review some of the remaining slides. Okay. On slide 26, like I said, there's more information about the waiver details, and both the links included are live links. This one right here is, thank you, Morgan. Next slide. This is just, stay informed so you can make sure that you have all the information you need to know about HOPWA and HOPWA's response to COVID-19. You can sign up for the mailing list. There are directions here on this slide and additional information. All the links are also live. Next slide includes several resources. We encourage you to select each of these and read through. The next one, HOPWA Ask a Question. If you have a question about the HOPWA program, a notice, waiver, implementing COVID-19 activities, we really love to hear from you. Seriously, we love getting HOPWA AAQs. So please go ahead and submit your question to the HOPWA Ask a Question portal. That link again is live, and there are directions on how to submit a question. Next slide. Also, technical assistance is available. So HOPWA grantees can submit a request for individualized TA related to responding to COVID-19 or regular HOPWA program administration. There are directions on this slide about how to submit a TA request. And next slide. Coming attractions. Please stay tuned. We have more webinars coming for all of you. We have also in August, there is going to be a webinar about short-term rent, mortgage, and utility payments, otherwise known as STRMU. Also in August, we're going to be doing a webinar titled HOPWA Program Intake, Initial and Annual Recertification using remote and virtual methods, which will be laid out similarly to what we did here today during this webinar. And near the end of August, there will also be a webinar about supportive services. So we hope you can all join. Stay tuned because there will definitely be information going out about how to register for each of those webinars. And the next slide, and some reminders. Make sure you're applying HUD guidance to the proper program. Remember, some grantees might be administering more than just HOPWA, so waivers and program guidance issued for other programs such as COC, Continuum of Care, and Emergency Solutions Grant, otherwise ESG, in most cases don't apply to HOPWA. Grantees are responsible for notifying HUD of their intention to use waiver flexibilities and develop new policies and procedures associated with using those waivers. And then grantee project sponsors are reminded to follow those plans and then update their own policies as outlined by their grantees. Lastly, guidance related to funding and implementation of COVID-19 activities. There are things that are new and changing every day, evolving, new information, different requirements emerge and are occurring. So again, make sure you're signed up and you're staying tuned to the HOPWA listserv, as well as the HOPWA COVID-19 page on the HUD Exchange. And there are a couple links here about HOPWA COVID-19 guidance, as well as HUD's Community Planning and Development HOPWA COVID-19 link. And lastly, we'll make sure to address all the outstanding questions that we were not able to answer during this presentation. But in the meantime, if you have any questions about any of the material or any of the comments or examples that were shown to you today, please feel free to submit a question to the HOPWA AAQ.
Okay. That is everything. I just wanted to thank everyone again for joining today, and stay tuned for all of these future webinars as discussed and answers to your questions that weren't answered today, and look for this webinar recording and all of its associated videos and materials to be posted on HUD Exchange shortly, no more than a few weeks. So thank you again for your time today. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much, everybody. And as one last reminder, don't forget, in the handout section, there is a guide which you could use, will help you plan for and implement HOPWA virtual inspections. Walking yourself through that guide, you can pretty much use that guide to create an addendum to your current policies, and also include some other like quick tips and hints for conducting virtual inspections, as well as the PDF version of this presentation today is also included in the handouts. Take care. Thank you.
Be well, everyone. Thank you for all your hard work.